Gagne with YouTube channel Gamebits with this week's IndieSider podcast where I play indie games and then interview the developer. This week I'm playing Ellipsis, released on February 11th for iOS for $2.99, going up soon to $4.99, and coming soon to Android and tvOS. A preview copy of the game was provided to me by the developer. I've been playing for a while. You can see all the levels that I've cleared, but I'm going to start at the beginning. Believe me, I do not want to reset my progress. I've worked too hard for this. But this is where you are controlling the main character simply by holding my finger. So wherever you see that circle moving, that's where my finger is. And your job is to collect first this little nucleus with the one atom, or vice versa, and then 2, and then 3, and then 4, and then optionally 5, and through the gate. And that's it. It starts that easy. It doesn't stay that easy. That's one of the great things about Ellipsis. Let's go to a slightly more difficult level. Now see, these things will kill me. I can just touch them, and boom! Kablooey, I'm dead. It sends me back to the beginning of the level, and I can start over. Now you'll notice that when I pop the little bubble, the atoms, or rather the nuclei, do not immediately get collected. And depending on how fast I touch the thing, they can actually go flying, which requires I then need to go round them up. So I can actually touch and open all 5 of these blue circles without actually collecting their innards, which will decrease my score. Each one of the 5 has 4 dots, so if you get them all, that is 4 stars. But you'll notice after you finish the level once, a timer appears at the top of the screen, and if you do it quickly enough, you can get 5 more little point things from there. Wait, oh, I missed one. Just one. So I'm going to have 1 short of a perfect score on that level, which is fine because I've gotten perfect scores so far. So I find this game very reminiscent of a lot of games that I like. Geometry Wars, for example. I've played that on my PS4, Geometry Wars 3. This, of course, has fewer dimensions than Geometry Wars 3. It's more like the original games in the series. And of course, if you are a classic gamer, you've probably played something called Crystal Quest or Crystal Crazy. I believe it was for the Mac, Apple IIgs, maybe even the 3DO. And this game reminds me a lot of that, where you have to collect all the items in the level and then escape through the gate without anything touching you or killing you. So it's a lot like that. Let me play another level or two before we get into this week's interview. Whoa, death. So few games have me, exclaiming so frequently in verbal outbursts as this game. And yet it's fairly fair because you have infinite lives and it gives you the opportunity to learn from your mistakes, which is a great thing. Also very unusual, no text anywhere in the game. You'll notice that there is no score. There's no instructions. If I tap this little thing, it just brings me to a map of the whole world, and I can turn the sound on and off, and that's just about it. It doesn't even have a title screen. So where I started this video, I was not coming in media res. This is actually how the game starts, just with a lot of circles, and you have to kind of decipher what it's trying to tell you to do. And it's fairly intuitive, so that's pretty cool. So now I'm going to get into the interview. So I'm going to continue playing this game. If you want to hear just the audio version of the interview, you can always find that at IndieSider.net. This is episode number 38, so you can go to IndieSider.net/38 for just the audio edition. Of course, you can also leave us reviews on iTunes or a thumbs up on YouTube. Thanks so much for listening. Today I'm speaking with one of the co-creators of Ellipsis and the founder of Salmi Games, that being Yassine Salmi. Hello, sir.
Hi, Ken.
How are you today?
Pretty good. And yourself?
Excellent. So I've been playing Ellipsis, having a great time with it. I'm curious to know a little bit more about its origin. Can you tell us about the evolution of this game? Do I understand correctly that it started with a game jam?
Yeah, that's right. Stefan and I jammed on this game in late summer 2013, so quite a while back. We wanted to explore like a more direct means of controlling your player on a touchscreen. We noticed that not many games do this, and what we found with our prototype is that it leads to very simple controls, and it could be quite fun and super intuitive to control your player this way. From there, we worked on the game off and on for about a year, and we had our first showcase in 2014 where we got a lot of good feedback, and it led to 2015 when we finally had a solid prototype, and we just took this simple concept and explored it as deeply as we could. What we've ended up with now is 125 levels of quite varied gameplay, and we've worked really hard to polish it as much as possible and make it really balanced and fun.
And where does the name come from? Because grammatically speaking, ellipsis is used to represent something that is being omitted. So how does that apply to this game?
Yeah, it means something that is omitted without losing the original meaning. Our code name for the game for a long time was Dot Avoid. We spent quite a bit of time brainstorming different names, ended up on ... and then just went with ellipsis because it sounded simpler.
So what is being omitted in this game?
A lot of the extra fluff. I think we really tried to cut down the game to its core in terms of both art style and gameplay and user interface. So we're omitting everything that is not really necessary to enjoy the game, hopefully.
Yeah, and I've noticed some things that most games would take for granted, which yours does not have, most specifically text. There are no written words in this game. There's no instructions, no heads-up display, no options or configuration screen, no scores. So why did you choose to go with such a purely visual as opposed to textual interface?
Yes, that started off as just a focus on clean aesthetics. We wanted to really take everything out that wasn't absolutely necessary. And then also it was a little bit of laziness. I really didn't want to have to localize text or deal with font rendering. But then the real big point was that it became like a design challenge. Like perhaps we didn't need text to explain the game to the players. And we noticed that most players just skip text in tutorials anyways. So it became a really fun and challenging exercise to try to make the game as accessible as possible. And it also forced us to not take shortcuts. Like when something didn't work right, and say, okay, we'll just throw some text at it and, that solves that problem. We really worked hard to make the game click for players. So it was really a fun challenge.
And it is a challenge because, as you said, you have to show, not tell the player. They have to intuit the mechanics and what works and what doesn't. And the fact that the first time you enter a level, there is no time limit, there's no urgency, really promotes a sense of playfulness. I know that some of the levels are very deadly, but there are also some levels that have these new characters or new objects that I'm allowed to just poke at and see what happens because there's no text explaining them and I just have to figure it out on my own.
Yeah, exactly. We really wanted to encourage the player to explore the environment. In some ways, it's a bit of an exploration game. After about 15, 20 levels, you figure out most of the basic mechanics, but those first few levels, it's quite an interesting experience to watch people play the game. And it took us a long time to get to the point where we felt comfortable with the first few levels and just handing it off to other people, and they would figure it out. Some people really got stuck early on, over and over again. Sorry, that was a bit rambly.
When you do have a game like this, there is a learning curve and no text to aid the player. You must have done some extensive play testing to make sure that the game was accurately conveying what the players are supposed to do. What was the reaction like to those early tests?
We did lots of play testing on a regular basis at showcases and on our own with friends. It was always a challenge finding new players because once you figured out how it works, you can't relearn it, so to speak. I would just hand over the tablet to players and just watch them. And then, if they really start asking too many questions, then, okay, what did I do wrong here? Or why isn't this mechanic coming across clearly? How can we fix that? The first time you play, you're right into the first level, and then we pull you out and you're in the map, and the mechanics for controlling the maps are slightly different from when you play the game. And we're trying to teach two different things almost at the same time, and this particular point was a real struggle to get right. So, the map, you cannot really slide it around the first few levels. We're very generous with the touch when you're selecting a level. So there's lots of little tricks we did in the first 4 to 5 levels to make that initial experience as smooth as possible for players.
Yeah, and I went back and I played those first few levels after having advanced further, and I could see more obviously how you were guiding the player along. It's a really elegant introduction to the game and its mechanics.
Thank you.
So when I was first playing the game, it struck me, actually even when I saw the trailer, it struck me as very reminiscent of a lot of discrete gameplay mechanics and aesthetics that I've seen over the years. I mentioned to you vector graphics from old coin-op arcade games, Geometry Wars, maybe a little Bit Trip. Later on, it really struck me how similar it is in some ways to Crystal Quest, with the old Macintosh game.
Yeah.
That's not to say that Ellipsis is in any way derivative. It's not. But what it instead is, it feels like it fits into an environment that I've encountered before. It feels like a game that I did play 20 years ago, and I can't put my finger quite on that memory because this game is unique, and I'm really engaged by that. So I mentioned, Crystal Quest, Geometry Wars. What were some of the games that inspired you when you were creating Ellipsis?
So visually, Geometry Wars was a definite influence, at least on the sort of basic shapes. For aesthetics, some of the more recent games like the minimalist games like Black and Sarcadia on tablets with a very, very cut down interface, those were a big influence. Personally, I was guided a lot by the games I grew up on, from the Nintendo and Super Nintendo era, in terms of like polish and control, like the fluidity of the control, and like in Super Mario World or in Zelda. Those had a big influence in terms of the quality I was aiming for with Ellipsis. The other thing is, in terms of art, is that we're not, we're both programmers. I suspect that the developers of Crystal Quest and Geometry Wars were also primarily programmers, and you sort of go with what works well for your development style. And we took simple shapes and just tried to make them as beautiful as possible.
You've mentioned a couple of times that you were working with a limited artistic talent budget, but in my opinion, I can't imagine a design that would work better for this game, because the black background, the bright neon shapes, everything stands out. It's always clear to me where I need to go and what I need to do. And I think if you were to try to over-design it, that would probably get in the way of the gameplay, and then you wouldn't be able to call it Ellipsis anymore, because instead of leaving things out, you'd be putting too much stuff in.
Sure. Yeah, the art is there to serve the gameplay as well. It should not get in the way of your understanding of the game.
So let's talk a bit about that gameplay. I was sitting in the movie theater waiting for Kung Fu Panda 3 to start, and I'm playing this game on my iPad mini, and like every 5 to 10 seconds there are verbal outbursts coming from my seat. Dang it! Oh, not again! I mean, I can't remember a game that had me responding that often in that manner. So let me ask you, do you consider Ellipsis to be fair?
Well, I certainly don't want to frustrate the player. I think it's fair in the sense that it doesn't have any random elements. Perhaps it's fair, but a little bit mean. The game does have like difficulty spikes, and some levels are really hard. But what we've noticed in our playtesting is that some people struggle more with rhythmic parts of the game, and some people struggle more with the chaotic part of the game. And that's been an interesting challenge to balance how we design our levels to not frustrate the player too much, or those types of players too much. We've tried to put in alternate paths that allow you to experience different types of gameplay depending on where you get stuck and if you get stuck. So yeah, I personally consider it fair, but it perhaps is not the nicest game.
Well, I like that even though there is no obvious difficulty setting that players can configure, they nonetheless can play to their own skill level. They need to get those first 4 atoms or nuclei, but the 5th one is optional, and once there's a timer present, that is optional. And the timer is only present if you go back and do the level again, which itself is optional. So as soon as you get those first 4, you can make a beeline for the exit, and anything beyond that is just gravy. So I go back and I do try to get as many stars as possible, but there are some levels where I'm just like, nope, I gotta lower my standards and be happy with just 3.
Yeah. You can actually finish the levels with just 1 star.
Really?
Yeah, if you avoid all the little dots.
Right, because once you burst the bubble, you don't need to collect what's inside them.
That's right.
Oh, I hadn't thought of that. So now I need to go back and try to get as low a score as possible.
Yeah, so we don't have achievements in yet, sort of something we had to cut in order to get the game done. But that's something we will be looking to add in future updates, and I think we figured out a way to do it without using text.
Wow, I would be very interested in seeing that. Text-free achievements. That's intriguing.
Yeah, and one thing I'd like to do is like sort of give an achievement for, if you manage to do like the minimal number of stars through the game or through the first set of 10, 20 levels. We'll be looking into that after release.
Speaking of the stars, is this like Geometry Wars where I need to get a certain number to unlock future levels?
No. We experimented quite a bit with that, with locking off levels, and we never found a good way to both do that and explain it to the player. So one thing we will have in a future update is some extra levels for players who collect a lot of stars. But we found that by gating the player, it was just frustrating the type of players who like to just speed run through the game. They just want to see the next level and the next level and the next level, and then they get stuck and they're like, well, I don't want to go play those early, easy levels again. So again, a tricky balance to find with this.
Yeah, I can imagine. So this is, as I mentioned, a very challenging game, and yet I have infinite lives, which never would have occurred in the classic coin-op environment where a game like Ellipsis would fit right in. In an arcade game, this game would be a quarter muncher. It would eat up so much of my money, and yet on the iOS, I can play as much as I want. Now, you could have changed that. You could have taken more of my quarters by providing in-app purchases. You could say like, the game itself is free, but if you want to play it this many times a day or this many times in a row, you have to buy the full game for $5. Unlock more games or more credits, kind of like Pac-Man 256 does, where you can play like 6 times in a row, but then you have to buy more credits. So why not take that opportunity to let players give you more money?
Right. So several reasons. The first one is it doesn't really fit into the sort of minimalist style of the game. Like, we don't have any text, and then suddenly have to put a pop-up and say, hey, give me more money so you can get more lives. I didn't find a way to make that fit. The other thing is, you mentioned the game is hard, and I didn't want to punish the player for dying, and you're going to die often, but it's meant to be a way to learn the mechanics of the game. So we wanted to make restarting and getting back into the game as simple and short as possible. So if you're worried about how many lives you have left, then yeah, we might extract more money from some players, but we'll also drive away a lot of other players. I think the main reason is I'm a bit of a purist, and I'm a really big fan of the classic you pay upfront one time and you get the whole game. So it doesn't mean we won't consider like in-app purchases for future versions, possibly like for the Android version, because the business model there is a little bit different. We are also possibly considering doing like an infinitely generated version of the game. But for this version of Ellipsis for iOS, we really want to stick with the premium game. You pay once, you get the full game.
I would happily pay money for more levels, for example, if there was some sort of a DLC as an in-app purchase. But if you were trying to get me to pay for more lives, when I was sitting there in that movie theater, I would not have played for very long because I was dying so often. I'm just like, if you want me to be done, then I'm done.
Perhaps we can wait till like the player gets to level 30 and then say, okay, now you have a limited number of lives. But that would again be mean.
Ooh, that would be mean. Wow, I like the way you think.
It's the same thing with ads. It's hard to to do this style of game and then put an ad on it, even though in terms of if you ignore the art style, you have a whole bunch of levels. You play 3 levels, you show an ad, but it doesn't feel right with everything else we're trying to do. I'm trying to at least be consistent with how we approach the game.
Right.
And I think that's more fair to the player as well. So I'm pretty sure we're leaving some money on the table, but hopefully it'll be appreciated by other players.
Right. So speaking of difficulty, one of the challenges I had playing this game on my iPad mini was that, and this is not unique to Ellipsis, my finger often obstructs my view of the action. And the last 2 games that I played on the IndieSider podcast, I was playing on tvOS, which was a phenomenal experience. And given the inspiration Ellipsis draws from Geometry Wars, that seems like it would be a perfect environment in which to play this game. Would you consider, just for me, porting this game to Apple TV?
Sure, just for you, Ken.
Thanks.
Actually, we're already working on an Apple TV version as we speak, and we hope to release that in the next few months. We're still trying to figure out what the best control scheme is. There's a bit of a challenge with the limited touch surface on the remote. We were also exploring how to control the game with a gamepad. So, for example, having your left stick control fast movement and your right stick control sort of more precise movement. That's actually quite fun. But yeah, we're working on that basically.
I'm glad you're supporting controllers because I played Momoka for Apple TV with a Nimbus SteelSeries controller. It was great. I played Lumino with the Siri remote, and it too was great, but I would have preferred it with the Nimbus, which it did not support.
Okay, right. No, we would definitely support gamepads. I mean, Apple wants you to support the remote as well, no matter what, which is tricky. I mean, it's just tricky to get right on a remote. Like, we're also going to look into whether we could do a sort of iPhone remote control. I've heard that some games are doing that.
Oh, sure, yep.
So that could be more fun with a bigger surface.
Yeah, I have not yet gotten my hands on an iPad Pro, but I would love to try Ellipsis on an iPad Pro.
So we also haven't been able to test it on iPad Pro directly. Apparently it's a lot easier.
I can imagine.
And the game works with the stylus as well, which I've been trying to pitch to Apple as a cool feature of Ellipsis.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
So let's go behind the scenes a little bit and talk about the corporate environment and machinations of Salmi Games. This game, Ellipsis, I looked on your Facebook page and you have about 1,600 likes, which is actually quite a few, especially for a game that, at the time of this recording, isn't even out yet. So to what do you attribute your successful marketing and community building around this game?
It's a combination of things. It was very important for us to start marketing early. It's a very competitive environment right now, and Ellipsis is a bit of a difficult game to explain. And launching as a premium title, it's also important that we get the game in front of as many people as possible. So we used Facebook very early on to communicate with players when we were demoing at events, to get feedback and to engage our audience and potential audience. We also use Facebook to invite people to beta test. We were quite successful with that. And the third is we also use Facebook ads, which is an incredible tool. We set a budget limit for ourselves of about 100 euros, and we wanted to see what we could accomplish with that, because the tools that Facebook provide are incredibly detailed. You can really run all sorts of little micro campaigns for $1 here or 50 cents there, and experiment with the type of audience, the video, text, pictures. So we ran dozens of campaigns. We reached out to an international audience from the get-go because we had no text, and we could experiment, see, is our audience more male or female, old, young? It allowed us to figure out which screenshots are popular or which screenshots resonate well with the audience, which is very important when you're doing your app store descriptions or your press release or your marketing materials. So yeah, we leverage Facebook really, really heavily, and it turned out to be really, really cheap. You could put your ads out in front of hundreds or thousands of potential audience, and you only pay for people who actually click through and take a look. I can't recommend it enough. If you take the time and effort to really look into it, you can get a really good return on your investment. So that, combined with organic growth, was very successful for us.
That's interesting, because with the lack of text, Ellipsis will presumably not need internationalization and will be available in a variety of different territories. But your ads on Facebook, those of course do have text. So how did you even choose what language to put your ads in?
One of the reasons I didn't want to do text in a game was to avoid localization, and it turns out it's really recommended that you localize your App Store descriptions. So we ended up doing that anyways. And when we got that translated, it was not a lot of text. We got a few extra sentences translated for updates or for Facebook ads. And then we used that to experiment on Facebook. So in French, in German, in Spanish, in Chinese as well. That was before we realized that Facebook was blocked in China.
Oops.
Yeah. But so we saw that we have a big audience in Latin America. The Spanish players seem to really like the look and feel of our game.
Excellent. Salmi Games is just primarily two people. You and Stefan Hell are doing all the graphics and all the coding. And that's a dramatic departure from your background, because between the two of you, you've worked for Electronic Arts, Sony, Havoc. What would you say is one of the biggest, or especially the most positive changes from going from one of those large environments where you gained some invaluable experience to working on your own project like Ellipsis?
You're working at those big companies, like you really benefit from working with people who are a lot more senior than you, and you can learn a ton from them. When you're working on your own game, you get to interact with your audience a lot more directly, and that's extremely satisfying. You get immediate feedback. There's also lots of downside of doing it on your own. You have to handle everything. You're now responsible for code, art, design, planning, bug fixing, PR, marketing, audio, and those are challenging things to juggle, especially when you have like a release upcoming and you have bugs and you need to get your marketing material out. It's really hard to context switch. It makes you really appreciate all the different roles in the big companies, like people that just hide away a lot of the problems that you never even think could possibly exist. When you're doing it on your own, you have to deal with all that by yourself. I mean, even outsourcing PR work is not really something you can do, because you still need to be involved if you want to maintain the message of your game. You still need to create the assets for the App Store. So it's a lot more work than you first expected if you want to do it correctly.
How long would you say it took you to create Ellipsis from that original game jam? Was it like 2.5 years?
It's 2.5 years, but not of continuous work. I say we've been working on it continuously for the last 10 months. And before that, I would say it's another 4 to 5 months of work.
If a game like this were being developed at EA or Sony, how long do you think it would have taken them?
That's a tricky question. I mean, if I was redoing Ellipsis, I could probably, get it out in 6 months, perhaps. It took us a while for us to arrive at this final point. Like, we iterate on the design, on the art, like, so many times. And we added features and then removed them, added features and removed them. If you were to do the whole process again, I imagine it would also take at least 12 months.
Okay, so given that this is an indie game, 2.5 years actually seems about on par.
Yeah. 2.5 years is not how much time I want to spend on it. I want to, 6 months and then work on the next game and work on the next game and work on the next game, because you can't put all your eggs in one basket, right? But 2.5 years is about on par.
Well, especially when it's Salmi Games' first game. I mean, if you rush to get your first game to market and it makes a bad impression, that's going to have consequences for your future games as well.
That's right. If you're trying to build a brand or a reputation, you need to maintain the same level of quality at all times, right?
Yeah, that's kind of like another indie studio, Zeboyd Games. Their first games, Cthulhu Saves the World and Breath of Death 7, were sold for about $1 or $2 each on Xbox and Steam. And, the quality of the game was worth more than that, but these games were their first introduction to games, and they wanted to make a good first impression. So they got these games into as many hands as possible, so that later on, when they started releasing games for $10 or $15, they already had a built-in audience.
Yeah. And I mean, that's also a very smart strategy. I guess they also learned a lot in the process and became better at producing games and perhaps releasing them more often.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Their very first games were text-based choose-your-own-adventure games for Xbox 360, which is not really the best platform to be making that kind of game, but it was enough of an experience to teach them how to code a game and release it on the Xbox platform.
Sure.
So one last question for you, if I may ask. I am chatting with you at what is about almost 9 o'clock p.m. your time. What is it that you do during the day if you spend your nights chatting with me about Ellipsis? During the day, I do a lot of freelancing to basically pay the bills. Yeah, I have a family to support, and I can't live the complete indie life, so I have to balance things. So during the day, I sell my soul to the corporate world. And at night, I try to make my dreams come true. Because for some people, indie games are their attempt at getting into the games industry, but you've already been there.
Right. So indie games was a way for me to get out of the games industry, like in a in the classic games industry, you work your ass off for games that you can feel proud of, but that if they do well, you'll see very little benefit of it. And I never liked that model. I saw indie games as a way to both explore my own concepts and sort of gamble on myself. Last time I tried to go indie, I didn't do it in a very smart way. I ended up taking all my savings and working on a game for way too long, and then, it not working out and having to go freelance. But now I'm trying to do it a little bit in a smarter manner, more sustainable, let's say.
Is that previous game that you worked on still available?
It was never released. It was called Swimming Under Clouds. Yeah, we worked on it for 2 or 3 years, and in 2011 we had to can it, basically.
Oh, well, maybe now that you have a more sustainable model in mind, maybe you'll revisit it.
Let's see. I'll never say no. It was an interesting game. We had design issues still to resolve, but it had potential.
Excellent. And as does Ellipsis, and as far as I'm concerned, that potential is certainly being realized. It releases for iOS on Thursday, February 11th, coming soon to Android, and I hope Apple TV. Can you remind our listeners where we can find you and your game online?
Yes, you can find the game on playellipsis.com. The links to the iTunes store will be there, and our newsletter sign up is also there if you'd like to, be notified when we release new versions of the game for different platforms.
Excellent, and there'll be links to all that in the show notes. Yassine, Salmi, thank you so much for your time.
Ken, thank you.